maybe the journey isn't so much about becoming anything. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you, so you can be who you were meant to be in the first place. Paulo Coelho. So you and I speak pretty often about worldviews. And I did a bit of thinking on this after we decided to have an episode on it. I think if you really think about what he's saying here, it's like worldview. People are inherently good. Another worldview. People are inherently evil and we have to learn to be good. Another worldview. People are right in the middle. We have the capacity for both, etc. And so who we are meant to be, if you think about that as, okay, we're inherently good and really we're becoming who we're meant to be, which is someone of virtue. And it's about shedding off the skin of everything that we're not, shedding off all that vice, which is a philosophical truth, meaning maybe it's philosophically true if you follow it out. Maybe it's not literally true. Who knows? But to me, it seems to be a belief that we're inherently good. And that as we get older, as we go through tribulations in life, all of these experiences we have, it's an opportunity to shed off all those things that we're not and becoming who, in his opinion, is who we're meant to be, which is a good person. So that's my starting statement.
I like it. I like it. It is like strange, like as you talked about those three, like inherently good, the flip side of that, or a bit of both and things. It's I don't know, fascinating to me that like these different wisdom traditions all seem to really stress this idea of the good. It's like, what do you focus on? Like in Buddhism, this thing of Buddha nature. It's like we all have that in us. Like Jesus, the kingdom of God is within you. Same thing in Confucianism, this thing of like sprouts. There's this parable about like a young person falling in a well where we all have this natural inclination to help. And I think that's true for all of us. My young kids, like, everybody, you see if there was something happened, a small child was in the road, oncoming traffic is coming. There's like this natural inclination to help. But there are like things that get in the way, like that quote of the shedding stuff. Like to me, one of the things that gets in the way of is like fear. If you think there's like a small child, there's traffic coming, I have this natural inclination to help, but yet I might be faced with this like fear that I have to navigate through. And that, it seems like it's one of these things that we have to, I don't know if you like let go or shed that completely, but to a point of where it's manageable. It's like not debilitating from the type of person that you were meant to be. It's I don't know, it's a fascinating thing how often fear, anxiety, all of this different type of stuff that comes in that essentially, I guess, we need to let go of a bit, or at least like, see it more clearly. But let me ask you though, what do you think about in the way of like some people talk about like the first half of life and the second half of life? Like maybe the first half of life is more of this like becoming, like more like creating, and then second half of life, I'm thinking, I can't quite think of the name, but there's a Richard Rohr book. I think it's Falling Upward, where he talks quite a bit about this of there's certain things that, like, in the way of growing up, like as a young person, you think of many people in school, you do adapt to the crowd. You do, like, assimilate and learn to, like, work together. And you are focused a bit on, like, success and achievement and things like that. Like, maybe those are all good in a way, like, depending on the season of life. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, 100%. And I think what I'd like to do is circle back a little bit to what you said, because I'm really happy that you brought up fear, because courage is one of the four virtues it's one of the four cardinal virtues. And the interesting thing about the cardinal virtues is that you can really take each of those virtues and you can expand upon it to the point where it includes virtue as a whole. So you could equate virtue and courage very, very simply. That's why they're cardinal virtues. They hinge upon each other, and all the other virtues hinge upon them as well. But you're mentioning this first half of life. Like when you're really young, we all know young kids. It's like they're unsocialized. They're kind of crazy sometimes. They do weird things. They do funny things. They do things that if an adult were to do it, it would be really socially unaccepted. Like
Yeah.
I I had my nephew a few months ago over, and we were sitting around the campfire, and he was like getting up from one chair, and then he was going up and standing over next to a tree, and then he was coming back over and kneeling by the fireplace. Like if you and I did that, they probably call the psychiatric hospital or something, thinking that we got to get this guy admitted. So when we're really young, it's like we have this natural impulse, and we explore and we do this and that, and then we get socialized, and we have to get socialized so that we can fit in and not get sent to a hospital. But I think we go through that phase of cowardice when we're teens, most of us, where we give in to peer pressure. We put on this face that we think everyone wants to see. And then over time, what hopefully happens is you become more courageous in the sense that you want to become more yourself. And you want to talk about what live according to nature really means. It really means living, like becoming who you actually are. And you could very easily make the argument that courage is the courage to genuinely be yourself. That's what courage ultimately means. So it's a very interesting thing, because you're talking about this first half of life. I think a lot of times that first half of life, it's not necessarily built on cowardice, but I think we tend to be a bit more putting on faces that other people want to see, as opposed to what we really are, and we get motivated by work and that kind of stuff, and life gets in the way. But to your point, there's this interesting thing that happens in the second half of life, or the second life, whatever you want to call it, where people tend to realize, oh shit, half my life is already gone. I'm tired of putting on this face. I'm tired of being someone else that I'm not. I'm just not, and I want to be myself. And that's really the consequence of that. Often is losing friends. Sometimes you have to change jobs. It's like it comes with this cost, but all of a sudden the benefit becomes way better than what you've realized. You have a different perspective on it, and yeah, I would say that that's fueled by courage.
Yeah. It's I don't know, it's really interesting to me, the like you said, becoming who you are. And I've written some stuff on that, and I wouldn't say I completely understand what that is, you know? Um but something that is, like, interesting to me is have you heard the thing of, like, you have to know something really well to break the rules. I think I butchered that something, but like, it's I think it's Picasso said something like, I had to like paint my whole life to begin painting like a child. It's like his stuff looks like in a way something that, my daughter could do. But it's not. I mean, it's like a real like master. And it makes me, as you were talking, I was thinking of Ram Dass, this late like spiritual teacher who passed a few years back. But in this documentary, Becoming Nobody, like he ends up becoming this like really the well-known psychologist. He's a professor in psychology at Harvard, and then kind of gets into psychedelics, like, spends decades in India and all over the place. But like I wonder if that thing, like that thing of like as he talks about like kind of putting on a mask, or it's like he's putting on his suit of the psychology professor, some of these things it seems like are a required part of the path. Like if he just wouldn't have done that, like he couldn't have done that at 15 years old and just skipped over. It's like in a way some of these things, just like Picasso couldn't have instantly take a shortcut to painting like that. They're like everything belongs in a way, like our path in life. It's like all of this, some of these things that require a really strong ego and things like that to do are like part of the thing, it seems like.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that there's not a standard rate at which we go through those phases. And people go through those at different rates. And I think you, sometimes people will describe someone as being an old soul. And I think what that is it's someone who's been through a lot of those phases really early in life. And then they just have that air of wisdom about them. But, you mentioned like becoming who you are, which is really what this quote is about, becoming who you really are. And you and I have spoken a few times about what we really are, because it's a very hard question to answer philosophically. It's like, are you someone that's inherently good? Are you someone that's inherently evil? And all of these are different worldviews. But I think one of the points that you and I settled on, more or less, and maybe you've changed your mind, maybe I've changed my mind, but we settled on something like what we really are fundamentally is a being intending to flourish. And so what that means is that we want to live a flourishing life. We want to reduce unnecessary suffering. We want to be okay with the suffering that is necessary and inherent in life. That's what we want. That's the state we want to achieve. And our path on how to get there and our perspective on how to get there, we become more wise as time goes on. So when you're a teenager and you're in a friend group, you're thinking, I need to be in this friend group in order to flourish. And that's probably true to some extent at the time, right? It's like, because obviously kids that don't have a friend group, they aren't socialized properly. And then, it creates all of these psychological issues later on. But I think when you think about it like that, as intending to flourish, meaning intention, meaning, that's what you want, but you're not always sure how to get there, and you're going to make mistakes along the way, but there is still that fundamental intention. All of a sudden, I think your point makes sense, that it's like sometimes there's phases you just have to get through in order for you to really, at the end, and maybe not right at the end, but throughout life, you become closer and closer to becoming who you actually are.
Yeah. I sometimes question the this thing of getting older and becoming wiser. Like back to that like part of that quote that you read. Maybe it's about unbecoming everything that isn't really you. I think we pick up a lot of neurotic habits, a lot of unwise um, things often along the way, whether from family, culture, just like whatever it is, navigating the world. Um, it's I don't know. It's a crazy thing, but it also makes me think about, like, in the way of this becoming who you are. I don't know. It's so difficult to answer, but for me, it's like hard to answer some of these things without saying like 4 or 5 different things, you know? So it's like one thing in some sort of way that I think is important would be the fact that we are constantly changing. It's like we're never in that status of I have I have like become who I am, period, dot. Like, at least to me, it like, maybe that is the case. Maybe there is some sort of like stable enlightenment or something like that. But like, that is an important thing. And it's like, even that thing of say, like, becoming wiser, like my point of tying that in, it's like, well, even if you have, quote unquote, become wiser, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a day where you do some really, really unwise things. So like, what, what does that mean in the way of like, does that mean, does becoming wiser mean that, 80% of the time I traditionally, it's so difficult to um like, in a way. I mean, it's not necessarily that difficult. I don't want to like overcomplicate it, but in a way of some of these things where it's like we're constantly changing, that project is never quite, finished, seems to be an important ingredient in some way.
Yeah, I would agree, because it seems no matter how, like, wisdom, you could say, you could make the rough case that as you become more wise, you do less foolish things, right? That's kind of the point. But you can still do things that are incredibly foolish. I when I moved into this house, for example, 2.5 years ago, or 2 years ago, actually, man, I had snow come down in my driveway, and I knew what I had to do. I didn't have a shovel with me. I left it at my old place. Didn't have a shovel. Was caved in. Couldn't get out. I knew what I had to do. I had to go ask a neighbor to borrow a shovel. I went out there with like some freaking small little tool and tried to shovel it, and then eventually my neighbor came over. But like, so full. Like, what a dumb thing to do. I knew better. So like, you find yourself into these situations where you do foolish stuff all the time. But that question, I think, is one of the points I think you were trying to make there is, just because you say people are inherently good, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person becomes more virtuous throughout their whole life. Why? Like you mentioned, socialization sometimes doesn't always work for you. You get caught up in the busyness of life. There's toxic things that happen. There's malevolence between people that can really throw you off guard. So like, what is it that allows you to really, hone in on that? Because it's not the case that people always become more virtuous as they get older, even though if we make the argument that they're inherently good. And I think really it gets down to what you and I talk about pretty often, which is just having a set of values and having some kind of system about you that you can measure yourself against. Because it's so easy. You and I spoke about this before we started recording, but it's so easy to get distracted by emotions and by your desires, which are not always the biggest priority at the moment. And then life goes by fast as well, and then you might end up like someone that may not be deemed as inherently good, even though we can make the argument that they are.
Yeah. It's it seems like there's something to trusting like some sort of inner goodness in not only yourself but others. Like, say that belief level is on a spectrum, and I mean, it's strange to me how much some of these wisdom traditions really stress this point. You know, they really make the point. And there's this book that recently came out. I haven't read it, but I like the title of like Trust the Gold, and it's in relation to this particular statue of the Buddha that had been like covered for so long, and they found that it was actually made of gold, and it was covered based on, you know, all sorts of conflict, and you know, it was covered in the way where you couldn't see the gold. But it's like, how do you trust that in yourself and others? But it's like, at the same time, human beings, we make mistakes. You know, we do things that are, you know, sometimes inconsiderate. But that it's like that worldview of trusting that, like in Christianity, you know, they talk about this thing of like seeing others like as Jesus or whatever it may be. It's like literally seeing others, seeing this like inner goodness in others, seeing them as you yourself, you know, because like also this idea of like the self doesn't exist. So sometimes like self improvement, like becoming who you are, what in the world do we mean by the self? You know, if we're this interconnected, interdependent, you know, thing.